In His Footsteps with Jim Cantelon.
As a Christian, I'm up and I'm down, just like you. Times when I'm in victory, if you will, and times when I'm in defeat. Mountains and valleys, it just seems to be a part of Christian experience. At times like that, it's good to remember the history of your faith, authentic history. And all of these places testify to the reality of Jesus. Welcome to In His Footsteps with Day of Discovery. I'm Jim Cantelon, standing in Capernaum, one of the most important cities in all of Jesus' life and ministry. In fact, this was his hometown. This is the place where he centered his ministry, where about 2/3 of his ministry, in fact, centered out of. It's a beautiful fishing village right on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and it's a very, very special historic site. So we're going to talk about Capernaum, but also we're going to talk about Galilee. Galilee is a critical component in the life of Jesus. And in doing that, we'll be looking at a few scriptural passages. And then Pam Suran is going to join me. She is one of Israel's most trusted guides, and she's going to give us some background in terms of the overall history and culture of this marvelous place. So right after this break, I'll be back with the Bible teaching. In Matthew chapter 4, beginning with verse 12, we read this. Now, when Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he departed to Galilee, and leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is by the sea in the regions of Zebulun and Naphtali, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and upon those who sat in the region and the shadow of death, light has dawned. From that time, Jesus began to preach and to say, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. I'm sitting in the ancient synagogue in Capernaum. Capernaum is a fascinating place, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But first of all, I want to talk about Galilee. As I just read the quote from Isaiah, in the Hebrew, it says, he will honor Galilee of the nations. God will honor Galilee of the nations, which is really quite the statement, because in the prophet's time, Isaiah's time, and throughout the course of subsequent centuries, Galilee was seen as a kind of a rump province, artificially created by Rome. It was not something that brought any honor or glory to anyone. In fact, if you were from Galilee, you were seen as a rustic. You were seen as someone who was a provincial. You spoke with a Galilean accent. And if you came into any major cosmopolitan areas like Jerusalem, you were immediately identified as, just a kind of a hokey, mountain dweller who couldn't speak the proper language. It was not a great place to be from. And yet, the prophet Isaiah is talking about God honoring Galilee. And you wonder, well, what's up with that? Now, first of all, Galilee is divided into two. You've got the upper Galilee, you have the lower Galilee, in two kind of steps. Upper Galilee is north of me here, about 20 miles up to the northern border and the foothills of Mount Hermon. And then just about 2 miles north of me, it steps down. And you come down, 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 past the Mount of Beatitudes, right to the Sea of Galilee. You can't see it from where I'm sitting, but I can see it. The Sea of Galilee is just about 300 or 400 feet away from me, right where I sit. So Galilee was surrounded on three sides by Gentiles, and it was separated from Judea by an area called Samaria. It was about 40 miles north to south and about 25 miles east to west. So it was a very, very small area. And the eastern border, just over here, is the Jordan River, the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and then what we now know in modern terms as the Golan Heights. Most of Jesus' life was spent in the Galilee. Nazareth, his town of birth and upbringing, I should say Bethlehem was where he was born, but as a young boy, Nazareth was where he lived. That's where he trained as a carpenter. That's where he developed his family relationships. But then later, and we just read it here, as an adult, after John the Baptist was killed, beheaded by Herod, Jesus moved right here to Capernaum, and this became his hometown, became his base of operations. And so here you've got, if you will, hometown Jesus in Capernaum. It was a fertile area. There was lots of olive oil produced here, lots of fish produced here. It was on several major trade routes, very, very cosmopolitan. Okay, so Capernaum itself. Capernaum comes from two Hebrew words, Kafar Nahum. It's the place of Nahum. We don't know what Nahum this was, but it's the only place where it was said, and this is in Mark chapter 2, verse 1, that Jesus felt at home here. He adopted this place. This was home. A lot of us can identify with that because we've adopted places as home too. Not necessarily the place where we were born, but we say, this is home for me. Well, this was home for Jesus. And he performed, Jesus did, a lot of miracles here. He healed a man with an unclean spirit here, and I want to get back to that in a minute. He healed a centurion's servant here. He healed a paralytic here. This is where the paralytic was brought by his friends to one of the houses around here, had a straw roof. They couldn't get in because of the crowd surrounding the house, so they climbed up on the roof, broke through the roof, and dropped this guy down right in front of Jesus. You remember that story. And Jesus was so impressed with their faith that he healed the guy. It was a place where Jesus did some remarkable things. Now, I want to look at this instance where he healed a demon-possessed man. And I'm doing this for a reason. This is absolutely fascinating to me. In Mark chapter 1, beginning in verse 21, they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue. Here, hello, synagogue, right here, and taught. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Now there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, "Let us alone. What have we to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Did you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Jesus delivers this guy. But you know what I find fascinating about this? This is the first instance where an unclean spirit makes a proclamation of who Jesus is. Right here in Capernaum. We know who you are. You are the Holy One of God. With exceptional moments in the course of the next 3 years. Even the disciples didn't get that. Peter at one point says, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God," at one point. But these demonic spirits knew exactly who Jesus was. On another occasion, just a few miles from here, Jesus delivered, it depends on whether you're reading Matthew or Mark, one man or two men of some horrible indwelling of evil spirits. They also said, "We know who you are. You're the Holy One of God." Well, it's here in Capernaum that confession, if you can call it that, of who Jesus is, was made by the dark side, if you will. So that's Capernaum for you, and I'll tell you, I find it absolutely fascinating. Okay, let's go back to Capernaum for a minute. Because it was on a major trade route, Capernaum, the Romans had a tax collection office here. They had a centurion posted here. There were probably 10 to 20 languages spoken here. It was a place where camel caravans came through, where foreign currency was exchanged, where money changers were making their percentage. It was a very active hive of activity, but it was so Gentilized that the Jewish residents of Jerusalem, for instance, wanted very little to do with anybody from here, especially Jews who chose to live here. Why would you choose to live there when you could live with us in Jerusalem? But it was such a cosmopolitan area. So in a sense, it was a worldly place in the proper sense of the word. Well, what I find really interesting here is that Jesus, when he was baptized by John, and the Lord said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased," he goes out in the wilderness to be tempted by the devil for 40 days. But from that point in time, he goes from being a provincial guy to being a guy who embraces the world. Capernaum, where we are right now, really was the catalytic influence in terms of Jesus beginning to embrace the world, because the world came through Capernaum. It didn't come through Jerusalem. It came through Capernaum. And so this hometown of Jesus was a worldly place, and it exposed him to the Gentiles. And we will see as time goes on how important that aspect of Jesus' ministry was. Coming up shortly, Pam Suran, one of Israel's most trusted guides, and she's going to give us a bit more of the background and the history of Capernaum. See you in a minute.
And now we return to In His Footsteps with Jim Cantelon on Day of Discovery.
So friends, for our interview segments, we're right here in Jerusalem, just a few hundred meters from the Western Wall. This happens to be Bar Mitzvah Day. Right now, I think they're having lunch, but you may hear some celebration before that day is done. Pam Suran is with me. She's been with me for the last several shows. She is a very trusted and a good friend of mine, Israeli guide, and recently retired. Enjoying your retirement, by the way?
It's not really a retirement. I'm working pretty hard
Selective
on a lot
guiding.
of different things.
So,
yes.
yeah, and plus you're a terrific artist. Let's talk about Jesus in his hometown. Now, we would all assume that Nazareth was his hometown, but it wasn't. Capernaum was. Why Capernaum? Or are we right in saying that?
Hold on.
Okay.
So he grew up in Nazareth.
Right.
But when he started his ministry, you go down to Matthew chapter 9, verse 1, it says he came to his own town. So this was like his base, his headquarters.
It's ministry base.
Because he didn't have a home.
That's right, he didn't have a house.
He was in a guest room.
Maybe Peter's?
That's it.
Yeah.
Peter and Andrew.
Because Peter and Andrew, they had a house there.
Yeah.
Okay. So is it right to call Capernaum his hometown then? Or?
Well, you could say his town. That's what the Gospel says.
His town.
His town.
His town.
Yeah.
Okay, tell us about Capernaum.
Okay, Capernaum, typical Jewish town, made up of Jewish family homes like Bethlehem,
right.
Only they're all, it's a flat area, so they're one next to another. And they're called insulae, or islands, because they're surrounded by alleyways. And they're multiple family homes with lots of different rooms, storerooms. They have a big family room with a kind of an arched ceiling. They've got outdoor kitchen where the women are all grinding with the basalt millstones, and the fire, the oven, and everything outside. And then they've got, of course, the guest room. So you have these, probably each family had their own little sort of apartment room where they'd sleep at night, and then they shared the inner courtyard, the open inner courtyard, and then also the living room and the storerooms.
And these houses would be made mainly of stone? With
basalt.
Basalt stone, which is volcanic stone,
because
black.
That's Capernaum.
Capernaum. And what would the roof be made of?
Generally speaking, this was a roof that was kind of portable, because we read this whole account of this paralytic where they roll back the roof and then they lower him down. So logs that are laid one next to another, and then that is covered with more thinner kind of sticks.
Or thatch, maybe?
And then comes the thatch.
And thatch on top of that, right?
Which is probably palm fronds.
Right.
And then on top of the palm fronds would be a layer of clay, of mud that they would roll. They had like a roller made out of stone, and then they would, when it rained, they would just roll it out. So you could roll that whole thing back.
Well, on that occasion when these guys, they want to get this paralytic to Jesus, and there's no access. The place is jammed with people outside the house. To get in the roof and lower him down, that would have taken a few minutes.
A few very dirty, dusty.
Yeah, well, with stuff falling down inside, right?
Yes.
While Jesus was teaching.
Lots of dirt falling down, and really disruptive. Definitely a disruptive moment, in the middle of all this teaching.
Now,
whatever.
Now, I remember Isaiah referring to Galilee of the Gentiles.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite scriptures.
Yeah. Now, Capernaum is right there in the center of Lower Galilee. So would there be quite a Gentile presence there?
Well, this is what happened. With the Assyrian invasion in the 8th century BC, the Assyrians came in and they conquered the northern tribes, the 10 tribes.
Right.
And there were deportations from those tribes of different tribes that were taken north into Assyria along the Tigris River to their capital area, Nineveh, Ashur, Chalev. And so those tribes were put there, and then they brought Assyrian subjects who were Gentiles. They brought them in and settled them in Samaria and in northern Israel.
So they displaced the Israelites
Exactly.
and replaced them with Gentiles.
Yeah.
So the Gentiles, of course, were the Syrians, but then later on, the Romans had quite a presence there too.
Well, see, what happens is you've got these Assyrians, they're planted in the land. So you have a number of them that become what's known as the Samaritans, because there were lions about and they were getting frightened by this, and so they turned to a priest from the tribe of Levi to teach them, and so they became sort of quasi-Israelites.
And would they
known as
intermarry
Samaritans.
with some of the Israelites as well, do you
No,
think?
no. This became quite a group that became at enmity with the Israelites because of later on Alexander the Great and Hellenism, and they built a temple that was very Hellenistic, and so it was rejected by
So did these people
Judeans.
eventually migrate down to that area we know as Samaria?
Yes.
Ah. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah. So that's part of the story. Then you've got Assyrians that sort of gravitate towards these Hellenistic cities that are built after Alexander the Great. So they all become Hellenized, okay? And then what happens is then the Romans come in and they conquer. So it's the same group of people, but they go through all these different transitions.
Because there was a tax collection house there. There was a centurion there.
Yeah.
It seems to me that it must have had some significance for Rome, Capernaum.
Well, yes, because they were because there was a border there.
Right.
The Jordan River was the border, and it was the border to the Golan, where you had Gentile settlements and so forth. But when you crossed into a new district, you had to pay tax. You had to pay a toll tax
Right.
or whatever. So,
Right.
yeah,
Now, Capernaum is right on the shore of the Sea of Galilee.
yeah.
A lot of people have no awareness of the fact the Sea of Galilee is not a sea. It's more of a lake, at least by North American standards, as a lake.
Well, it's actually defined as a sea and a lake,
Oh, both.
both. Yeah.
Well, tell us about the Sea of Galilee.
Well, it's small,
Well, it's about 12 miles long and maybe about 6 miles.
about 14 miles long.
14 miles long, and
Yeah, and at the northern part is the widest part.
Right.
And then it's narrow at the southern part, and so it looks like a harp.
that's why Israelis
And
call it Kinneret, right? Harp.
Kinneret, it's after the Hebrew word kinor, which is an ancient Hebrew harp.
Right.
Okay, so it's in the shape of a harp,
Yeah.
and it's a freshwater sea or lake. It's fed by the Jordan River. There are 4 springs in the north which feed the Jordan River, so it's very fresh water, and it's a source of drinking water for the ancient villages and towns around the sea, and then also even today it's a water source.
You know, I've had people ask me when they find out how small a lake was or is, how in the world it could become so stormy. Why? Why was it such a chaotic sea at times?
Well, there's a wind, a special wind that comes from the northeast that barrels down off of the Golan Heights, and it comes, and when it hits the water is fairly shallow. The water really responds in these giant waves. And I've seen the sea under these conditions. It's called a sharkia in Arabic, the east wind. And the waves are so intense that you cannot sail a boat. In fact, I almost capsized once.
Really?
In a sharkia.
What were you doing out there in the Sharkia? Tempting fate.
A crazy group.
Crazy group. Well, I'm glad you didn't drown. Recently, that Jesus boat, as they call it, was discovered.
Yes.
It's now in Kibbutz Ginesar. A beautiful thing to see. But if that was a typical fishing boat of the time, I can see how a big wave could just capsize it almost instantly.
Now, my husband was a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee, and when that sharkia would begin, they headed immediately to shore. It didn't matter where they were, they went right to
Now,
shore.
excuse me, your husband was a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee?
Yes, he was.
That's very cool. How does it feel to be the wife of a fisherman from the Sea of Galilee?
Well, it's very real.
I think it's terrific. Now, how would the Sea of Galilee had a lot of fish in it? Would Capernaum be a fishing town?
Yes, there were fishing towns. All the big towns around the sea were fishing towns. And so you had your local fishermen, and every morning you would see them with their nets, stretching out their nets and drying their nets. And of course, they gathered all their fish up. They would bring it over to Migdal or Magdala,
Right.
which is the name for tower, where they would have the fish salted and preserved that way. That's how they would preserve
And then they would
fish.
ship them out to various markets?
In fact, there was a very popular kind of fish sauce,
Really?
a fermented fish sauce in the Roman Empire, and they made it there too.
Really? Now, let's talk about Jesus and the Sea of Galilee. We see him feeding 5,000 people right off the shore. We see him preaching from a boat. We see him walking on the water. We see him asleep in a sharkia, storm. Played a big role in his life, huh?
Yeah, it was very much his stage for demonstrating the power of God, and also just preaching to the people and relating to the people, because it was so much a part of their life. It was something that they could relate to. Like, for instance, that parable of the millstone. He was warning them about corrupting a young, tender, naive mind. They said it would be better that you would have a millstone tied around your neck and that you would be thrown into the depths of the sea, that kind of thing. So everything was so clear to them in their life context.
When Jesus calmed the water, the disciples, of course, were very impressed. They said, "Who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him?" They see him walking on the water. They're blown away, scared, the daylights out of them, until Peter impulsively decided to try walking, and it worked until he got scared. Why do you suppose the disciples were so obtuse in the final analysis? They saw all this stuff on the Sea of Galilee. They saw him healing people, and yet they kept insisting in their mind's eye that one day they were going to be the cabinet. Jesus was going to be the Messiah, and they argued as to who would sit in the right and the left. And then when the wheels fell off at Calvary, they all forsook him and fled. Were these guys just dense?
Well, there was a judicial blindness that came upon the people.
What kind of blindness?
Judicial blindness.
Judicial blindness.
This is a judgment that God alone is in control of.
I see.
You go back to Isaiah 6,
Yeah.
and you see it there. You see it repeated in Romans chapter 11. So people are basically blind.
Yeah.
Judeans and Israelites are blind until they have this encounter with the risen Lord.
Right.
You see, it wasn't until he rose from the dead that people started to wake up.
There's a place to stop. Pam Suran, you've done yeoman service.
Thanks.
It all pivots on the resurrection. Boy, I'm with you there. If Christ be not risen, our faith is in vain. We'll take a break and I'll be back with a close right after this.
And now we return to In His Footsteps with Jim Cantelon on Day of Discovery.
One of the things that really means a lot to me personally about Christian faith is that it's rooted not in mystery, but in history. There's an empty tomb in Jerusalem, which we're going to be seeing. It's a historic fact. It's not rooted in some mysterious revelation that somebody had under a tree one day. This is an empty tomb in Jerusalem where Jesus was buried and he rose again. But there's history whenever you study the Bible. For instance, right here in Capernaum, there's a synagogue, which I've told you is authentic in terms of the last, almost 2,000 years. But at the base of the synagogue that currently exists is the basalt foundation. Basalt meaning volcanic rock, always black. And you can see it right there. I'm just looking at it right now as I'm talking to you. And then just over my shoulder here, there's a pillar. In Hebrew it says, Alphaeus, son of Zebedee, son of John, built this pillar. Right there. History is absolutely critical. And you know, friends, there are times when, as a Christian, I'm up and I'm down, just like you. Times when I'm in victory, if you will, and times when I'm in defeat. Mountains and valleys. It just seems to be a part of Christian experience. At times like that, it's good to remember the history of your faith, authentic history. And all of these places testify to the reality of Jesus. Jesus lived here. This is his hometown. He slept here. Over to my right is Peter's house. Many times Jesus, I'm sure, would stay there. He healed Peter's mother-in-law there. I mean, it's all historic. So be encouraged when you are discouraged with the fact that your faith is not dependent on how you feel. Your faith is dependent on an empty tomb and absolutely historical, authentic site after site after site where Jesus lived and breathed and ministered. So, with that, I'll say goodbye for now, and I'll see you next time.
Join us again next week at this same time for another Day of Discovery. Day of Discovery is a video outreach of Our Daily Bread Ministries Canada and is supported by the free will gifts of friends like you who enjoy these programs. For more information about Our Daily Bread Ministries Canada, please visit us online at ourdailybread.ca.